Hi everyone. My name is Wes Higby. Welcome to my course, Managing Docker on Linux Servers. When I first took a peek under the cover, of Docker, I was pleasantly surprised to find simple building blocks like namespaces coalesced into a powerful concept that we all know as containers. And I say simply because it was just features of Linux toggled on or off in a novel way to create a virtually isolated environment out of what was yet another process running on my machine. And that's why I'm excited to share this course with you to get you up and running with Docker Engine, specifically within Linux environments. Some of the major topics that we'll cover include installing Docker Engine on your preferred distro, how to simplify connections with Docker context, how to secure remote access, how to use Containerd directly, one of the many pluggable backend components of Docker. Last, how to update the Docker Engine. By the end of this course, you'll be able to deploy Docker Engine for Linux. Before beginning this course, you should be familiar with the basics of using Docker. When I say using, I mean pulling an image, running a container, not necessarily understanding the nuances of what's going on behind the scenes. All right, let's get started. When it comes to Docker on Linux, I think I most appreciate the simplicity of being able to run containers using Docker in a Linux environment without much else. I can just spin up containers because containers are just processes that are isolated and they're Linux containers and I'm working on Linux, so I can install some basic Docker tooling and get up and running rather quickly and not worry about what exactly is happening behind the scenes to make this possible, because I'm sure quite a few of you have already used a version of Docker for Windows or for Mac, referred to as Docker Desktop, and then for Windows or Mac. And of course, if we're talking about Linux containers, that begs the question, how does a Windows machine or a Mac machine run Linux containers? It's obvious how a Linux machine would do it, but it's not possible just to run Linux processes right on a Windows machine or a Mac machine, let alone isolated processes, whatever that exactly means. And by the way, I most appreciate the simplicity of being able to run containers using Docker in a Linux environment without much else. We can just spin up out on GitHub, grab the URL right from the address bar, or you can come to the topmost level of the repo and you can click this code button here and get some instructions on how to download this. And then open them up inside of a terminal. It doesn't really matter if you're on Mac or Windows or Linux. You'll be able to spin up these VMs no matter what, because Vagrant is cross-platform, and that's a beautiful thing. So I'm going to change into the installing folder, which is meant to represent the files for this first installation module in the course. And inside of here, you will see the 3 different folders for the various distributions and versions that I intend to set up examples for you to work with, so that we can spin up Linux VMs. Now that's the end goal. Remember, we want Linux environments to work inside of, regardless if our host is Mac, Windows, or Linux. We want these throwaway learning environments that have Linux inside of them, and then we'll go into them as if there's nothing else in the outside world, unless we'd like to do some testing from the outside world. But we'll go into them and do things like install Docker and tinker around with it and learn with it, throw away the environment, recreate it, do all sorts of fun things along the way. Okay, we've got Vagrant installed, and we've got one more dependency we need. And I want to throw this your way and see if you can come up with the answer. It's represented by that dashed line around our VM, and it harks back to that example I talked about earlier with Docker for Windows and Docker for Mac. What component are we missing still? So Vagrant is a tool that helps you automate the creation of VMs, but it is not a hypervisor itself. And depending on your platform or your baby, if it's a Windows machine, you might want to use Hyper-V, or you could use VirtualBox, which is a cross-platform hypervisor. It's a hypervisor I'll be using in this course, which you can also use on Mac. So we need some sort of hypervisor installed, and it just so happens that I have that installed already, but I want to show you where you can find out a bit more about this. So out in the docs for Vagrant, vagrantup.com/docs, if you come under the section called providers, these are referred to as providers. They're more or less your hypervisors. You'll see there are some prominent references here to VirtualBox, VMware, Docker, and Hyper-V. Focus on Hyper-V, VMware, or VirtualBox. If you have a preference, feel free to go that route. Otherwise, you can use VirtualBox like me, and it'll work on just about any platform that you are operating from. Now, in my case, to install VirtualBox, one of 2 routes to go. Just like with Vagrant, I can come out to the download page for VirtualBox and grab a copy of the latest version of it. So I can say OSX host, click that link there, and I'll start downloading the installer for that. Or I could download the Windows installer. I, however, like that command line tool to manage my packages, so if I list out the installed casks, you can see here for Homebrew, this is all Homebrew terminology, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, but you can see I already have VirtualBox installed, so I'm good to go. Of course, over on Windows, you might use Chocolatey to install VirtualBox, or you might use a different package manager on a Linux environment. At the end of the day, come over to the command line, type out vboxmanage, and then pass the version flag to see what version of vboxmanage you have on your machine. You can see here 6.1.16. That's the latest version at the time of recording, as you can see on that past page for the VirtualBox download. So it looks like I've got the tools in place that I need to be able to spin up VMs. I've got my hypervisor. Again, that's the little dashed lines represented here around my VM. I've got Vagrant, which is going to allow me to create these VMs easily with VirtualBox under the hood. It's also going to allow me to pull down pre-built distributions of Linux off of Vagrant Cloud, like I mentioned a moment ago. You'll see how that really rocks. If you are familiar with Docker, you can think of this as the equivalent of Docker Hub, but for VM images. I, to this day, believe that both Docker and Vagrant are so incredibly popular. Yes, Vagrant isn't quite as popular as Docker, but it is really popular. But both of them are popular because they have a simple means of pulling pre-built images for a VM called boxes with Vagrant, or in the case of Docker for containers, images off of Docker Hub. Okay, so we are ready to go to create our first Linux VM. Again, inside of which we will then experiment with Docker, which is the whole point. So I'm going to change into the CentOS 8 folder. Remember, there's nothing inside of here, just a git keep file to keep this directory available so you can navigate to it. And inside of here, I'm going to use the vagrant command and use the init subcommand. This will create what's known as a vagrant file. Now before I do that, I need to pass to this the name of a box, which is the VM image that we're going to be booting up off of. So you can think of that as the starting point for our VM. Where do I go to find that again? I'm going to hop out to Vagrant Cloud and search around for a box that I can use for CentOS. Now right out of the gate, you can see there's a CentOS 7 box available. And I like to come into one of these boxes sometimes. If it's not the right version, I'll still come into that box. And then I'll click on the very first part of the name here, because this is the organization name. You'll see at the bottom the link there shows /CentOS. If I click that, this will show me all of CentOS's images. Now don't assume that this is the official CentOS organization out on Vagrant Cloud. It possibly is. Whenever you're working with orgs and boxes on Vagrant Cloud or Docker Hub or anywhere, you really should make sure that you can trust them. In the case of CentOS, to verify that that organization is safe out on Vagrant Cloud, I can come out to the actual CentOS.org organization